Happy Sabbath. How are you all? I hope you all had a wonderful, wonderful week. Tonight, I ask the Lord to continue to bless you with love, joy, peace coming from the above. Tonight, we are going to study chapter 10 of Genesis. And this is a very interesting chapter. Some may think that it's boring, but it has more than the eye can see. We call this chapter the Table of Nations. It is a very unique record. It is sort of like a genealogy, like telling you who's the father, who's the son, who begets who. But that's not its main purpose, because the main genealogy from Adam to Abram is in the next chapter, Genesis chapter 11. So this chapter, chapter 10, it did a few things. First of all, it introduced Abram to prepare us for chapter 12, when God chose Abram to get out of where he was in his hometown, and saying that he will use him to bless all the nations. And also here, Moses is reminding us that God is not just the God of Israel, but he is the God of all nations. And his final plan is more than just his covenant with Israel, and it is for all the nations of the world. So this chapter is the Table of Nations, setting the background for Abram to come in ushering the nations of Israel, and then to the Messiah. So what's the purpose? The purpose of this chapter is given in the beginning and the end verses, verse 1 and verse 32, emphasizing that the earth was repopulated as God had planned after the flood by the descendants of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Let me read to you verse 1 and verse 32, and it is about the purpose of this chapter. Verse 1, now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and sons were born to them after the flood. Verse 32, these are the families of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies by the nations, and out of these nations was separated on the earth after the flood. So let's look at the map of how Noah's offspring spread in all directions of the world. In the east to Elam, which is southwest Iran. West to Tarshish, which is southern Spain. South to Seba, which is East Africa, and Sheba, which is Yemen. And north to Ashkenaz, the Scythians, which is Ukraine. It is difficult for us to identify some of these nations and give them modern names. Over the centuries, nations can change their names. They can move to different locations. They can modify the language and even alter their racial composition through intermarriage. And the listing for the nation is not complete. Like, for example, we don't find Edom there, we don't find Moab there, and we don't find Ammon there. And yet, these were important nations in biblical history. The fact that there are 70 nations in the list suggests perhaps that the arrangement is deliberate, intent to point forward something that has not yet been introduced here. You see, 70 is a biblical symbolic number that represents totality and completion. A theologian, Kenneth Matthew, says, and let me show you and I quote him, this multiple of 7 and 10, which is 70, numerical figures indicating completeness, indicates that the whole of the world's families are under the eye of God. Isn't it comforting? Well, perhaps it's also pointing to the 70 persons in Jacob's family when they went to Egypt, right? You remember? Genesis 46:27 and Exodus 1:5. Or we remember there's another 70 in the New Testament, the 70 disciples of our Lord, who was sent out to preach the gospel. So either way you look at it, it is pointing to salvation. Now let's read verse 2 until verse 5. This is about Japheth's descendants. The sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Terah. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphath and Togarmah. The sons of Javan were Elisha and Tarshish, Kittim and Dodanim. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. Now let's look at this chart. It shows the descendants of Noah. So let's begin with Japheth that we just read, right? Okay. Japheth was the father of the Indo-European people. They settle in areas that's reachable by ship, according to verse 5, right? They were coastal people. Gomer's a Germanic people from whom arose the origin of French, Spanish, and Celtic settlers. And Magog, mentioned also in Ezekiel 38 and Revelation chapter 20. They are people from the northeast of the Black Sea, the Russians. And Madai, the ancient Medes people that inhabited current-day Iran and Iraq. And the peoples of India may also be from this son. Javan, the ancient Greeks. Tubal, maybe Pontus. Today it is the eastern Black Sea region of Turkey. Meshech, modern-day Turkey. Terah, maybe Thrace. This region is now split between Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. So from here, you look at the chart, 7 sons and 7 grandsons are named. And the 7 grandsons are from only 2 of the sons. You notice? Does it mean that the other 5 sons had no children? Well, many scholars think that these are not the names of Noah's grandsons and great-grandsons. They are probably names of people groups. So the overview of this chart and also this passage about Japheth is that Japheth is the ancestor of the Gentile nation who located north and west of the land of Canaan. For the Jews, this would be the distant nations, the countries that represented the outer limits or at the border of civilization. You can look at that at Psalms 72, verse 8 to 10. So let's read on, verses 6 to 7. Now we're talking about the descendants of Ham. And the sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim, and Phut and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah, and Septa, and Ramah, and Septical, and the sons of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. Ham's descendants populated Egypt, Palestine, the Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Cush is the ancient Ethiopia. Right now, today is the southern part of Sudan. Mizraim. This is another way the Bible refers to Egypt, and today is still Egypt. Phut refers to Libya. Canaan refers to what we would consider modern-day Israel and the surrounding areas. So at this point in the listing of Ham's descendants, the passage somehow digresses off to discuss a famous man, Nimrod, the founder of a great empire. Let's read verses 8 to 12. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And from that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, and Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Well, Nimrod is mentioned because the nations he founded play an important part in the history of Israel. And also because one of them, Babel, is discussed in the next chapter, chapter 11 of Genesis. Nimrod is called mighty one in the earth and a mighty hunter before the Lord. The word translated mighty refers to a champion, somebody who is superior in strength and courage. So mighty indicate strength, superior in strength and courage. In this passage, the description of Nimrod as a hunter is not referring to him as a hunter in a sportsman hunting game of animals, but rather of a hunter of man. He was a tyrant, ruthlessly conquering men and establishing empire. According to the verses that I read, he built 4 cities in Shinar. Shinar is Babylonia, and 4 more in Assyria. You know that both Babylon and Assyria eventually became the enemies of Israel, and they were used of God to discipline his disobedient people. And we'll learn more about Babylon in the next study. And now let's go to Shem. I'm not going to read the verses because it's just a lot of names. You can read it, okay? Shem is usually mentioned first, but he is listed last this time, so that the story can move right into the story in chapter 11 about the Tower of Babel and the genealogy of Abraham, who descended from Shem. 5 sons are mentioned here, but the emphasis is on the family of Arphaxad, because he was the grandfather of Eber, and Eber is the great-great-great-grandfather of Abraham, the father of the Hebrew nation, Israel. And Abraham's story begins in chapter 12. So where did the descendants of Shem disperse to? Okay, Elam, he's the ancestor of the Persian people. Asher, the father of the Assyrians. Lud, the Lydian people. Aram, the father of Aramean, also known as Syria. Arphaxad, the ancestor of Abraham and the Hebrews. In the middle of this genealogy of Shem, there's another digression in verse 25 to discuss the dividing of the earth during the days of Peleg. Peleg means division. This is probably referring to the dividing and dispersing of the nation described in the next chapter, chapter 11, because many languages came as a result of God's displeasure at the Tower of Babel. You remember the story, right? However, some people think this division is referring to a special dividing of the continents and rearranging of the land masses. So, these are the descendants of 3 sons of Noah. So what does this chapter tell us about God? This list of names and places tell us that God is the Lord of the nations. God gave the nations their inheritance, just as what Deuteronomy 32:8 said. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of people according to the number of the children of Israel, and also according to Acts chapter 17 verse 26. And it talks about God hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of the habitation. So God determined the time before it was appointed, and the boundary of their habitations. God knows way ahead of time, and he had his plan way in the beginning. Even though there were powerful rulers like Nimrod, God is the God of geography and of history. He is in control. What God promised, he performs. And Noah's prophecy about his sons came true. Second question. What does this chapter tell us about humanity? In spite of external differences, all nations belong to the same human family. God made us all of one blood. Remember just now I read from Acts 17:26. And no race of people can claim to be the superior to any other races or people. While in his providence, God has permitted some nations to make greater progress economically and politically than other nations. Their achievements don't prove that they are better than others. Let's look at Proverbs 22, verse 2. It says, the rich and poor meet together. The Lord is the maker of them all. God has a purpose for the nations. The story in Genesis 9:24 until chapter 11, verse 32 tell us that God's chosen nation was Israel. And then from chapter 12 onward, the stories are focused on Israel. But we can also see that God used Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Medo-Persia, and Rome to accomplish his purposes with reference to the Jewish people. God can use pagan rulers like Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Darius, and even Augustus Caesar. It also means that God made you and me for a special purpose. He called us. He defined you and me and gave us specific talents, gifts, and dreams. He has continued to call on you and me throughout our lives, giving us guidance, direction, and protection. And this is the truth about who we are as his beloved children, and we are saved by his grace forever. Third question. What does this chapter tell us how we should live our lives? God should be the highest priority in our lives. Abiding in him will impact our lives. We need to trust him, meaning to look beyond what we can see and trust what God sees. Noah's 3 sons left us a mixed legacy to the world. But the Lord of the nations is still in charge, and story is still his story.